Hello, and welcome to the Six Figure Developer Podcast, the podcast where we talk about new and exciting technologies, professional development, clean code, career advancement, and more. I'm John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.
With us today is Jeremy Likness. Jeremy is a senior program manager for .NET Data at Microsoft. His personal mission is to empower developers to be their best. Welcome, Jeremy.
And I'm Jeremy Likness. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, sure. So kind of before we get into the meat of things, would you give our listeners a little introduction to yourself? Tell them how you got started in the industry.
Oh boy, how I got started. So I've always wanted to be a developer. I started programming when I was a young kid. For a lot of listeners, they may not have heard of a Texas Instruments TI-99-4A. That was my first computer, and then I grew up on a Commodore 64. But it was actually interesting for me because, and I'll try to keep this short story boring, but I went to college for computer science and ended up not completing it. We could say dropped out, kicked out, whatever, but I just did not finish college and had sort of the mindset that because I didn't have that degree, I wouldn't make it in the computer industry. So I did a lot of oddball jobs. I had a job at an insurance company as a Spanish-speaking claims representative. And so that's a whole story wrapped up in that. But let's just say the focus was on productivity. And when my application would break and I realized that IT would just come and type a few commands and reboot the application, I said, why call IT? I can just restart this myself. And IT caught wind of that. They said, well, we noticed you've been hacking around a little bit. You're in customer service. What do you think about programming? I'm like, well, actually, let me tell you, I love programming. Here's what I do. So they said, well, we got a great job for you. Come over to the IT department. So I did. And the great job for me was a night shift, swapping out ink cartridges in massive printers. But there was a light at the end of the tunnel. I wrote some software to optimize the order that the reports came in. So I had to swap the filters less. So that gave me some time to study the language that the mainframe was running at the time. And that segued into a computer job. So that's how I got started. I worked my way up from speaking Spanish and taking automobile claims to running printers to writing code.
Wow. So, now you're the program manager for .NET Data at Microsoft. What is that? What does that mean for you from on a day-to-day basis?
Oh, it means quite a bit. So there's some very tangible, specific things I do. I work very closely with the Entity Framework core team and on that product and just understanding how we can continue to evolve that, make that better, and address how we prioritize releases that come out for that. I work with the .NET for Apache Spark team. So that's the big data. And again, similar set of roles. And then the broader perspective that's less tangible is really looking at the all-up experience of working with data in .NET. And that can be everything from APIs to connecting to SQL Server, et cetera. So one of the focus areas I have right now, for example, is GraphQL. And what does that mean for me? It means just understanding what the ecosystem looks like, what the experience looks like for .NET developers, and then figuring out ways that we can make that experience better if there is a need. Sometimes there's not a need. Sometimes people say this is exactly how we want it to be. But day to day, I'm thinking about data. I'm thinking about, as a .NET developer who has to connect with data, can you find the resources you need, the tools you need? And if there's a way that we can, through our documentation or through our tools, make that experience better, then I go out and make a case for that and show that there is a problem to solve, kind of get the feedback. And once we have a case that says, yes, this is a problem, here's the evidence that customers have that issue, then we go to correct it and baseline it and measure it and see how we're doing with that.
Excellent. And the three of us are primarily line of business application developers. Historically, a lot of SQL Server backend. So you usually picking up something like EF or EF Core, some kind of ORM to help us facilitate the connections to our databases and persistence layers. I really enjoy a lot of the connectors in EF Core as well now include things that maybe you wouldn't think of that an ORM would handle. Something like a Cosmos DB or non relational data.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting one. Is when I describe Entity Framework Core, I have to say it's an object relational, and I put the relational in quotes now because Cosmos DB is non-relational. Now it makes it easier for us because it works with a SQL dialect. So we've got some leverage there because the other providers for EF Core are all relational SQL dialect providers. But it is, at the end of the day, the idea is let me work on a set of domain classes that make sense for how I'm architecting my software application, my compute, and don't force me to artificially modify, manipulate, or change how I approach that model just because of the constraints imposed on me by the database. So hopefully we can provide a way to take those domain objects and then naturally interact with them and have most of that persistence abstracted. But one of the philosophies of the team is that we know that you can only do so much, right? Sometimes you have those edge cases. So it's very much a piece of the philosophy behind EF Core to allow you to get underneath the hood so you can access the database object. You can get down to the raw connection so you can tweak it when you need to. But for that 80% set of scenarios, hopefully we provide you a set of conventions and building blocks that make it just work in an easier way than if you're, handwriting SQL code or using data transfer objects at a raw level and mapping, properties and dictionaries and all the fun things that happen at low-level database programming, right?
So I know with older versions of EF, there's like I forget exactly what it's called, like a SQL connector, and I assume there's like some kind of Cosmos DB connector. Is there, if a company that I was working for, or if I had a personal project that needed to connect to Bob's basic data source, which is like a custom, I don't know, whatever, is there any kind of easy way that I could adapt a connector or an adapter to that data source and still use EF?
So I would struggle to say there's an easy way to do it. So we have this provider model, and providers are sort of like facades, right, to different database backends. But I say sort of because they have to understand the nuance of each database. So SQLite has a slightly different dialect than SQL Server. And so you can't just assume you're going to be able to swap them out transparently because there's limitations that, this thing supported at SQL Server, this isn't with SQLite. So the provider has to do quite a bit of work. It does everything from taking, for example, a link query and figuring out how to materialize that in the dialect of the database that you're talking to. And if I say something as simple as date is less than 5 days ago, using like datetime now add days -5, that will translate to something very different for SQL Server and for SQLite. And so the provider has to be smart enough to walk the expression tree that's created as part of the link query, translate that to the dialect, but then its job's not done, right? Because once it passes it to the server, then it has to understand one of the millions of ways you might project the results. The easy way is you have an entity that sort of correlates to what's in the database and you project the values onto that. But you might use an anonymous type. You might just be pulling off certain properties. You might even map it onto a different CLR type. So there's a whole materialization step. And all of these pieces are part of the provider model. And EF Core is set up in a way that we try to have common services. Like there's a relational provider that the specific providers are built on top of that provides kind of the core services that are common across all relational, and then you can override it and tweak it. But if you want Bob's database to be supported, you find the provider that looks the most like Bob's database. You fork that, and then you start going through and tweaking and making the changes to the dialect you want to. If it's a SQL-like dialect, it might be fairly straightforward. For something like a Cosmos provider, though, it can be months of effort to make that translation. So the fortunate thing is everything EF Core is open source. We do everything out in the open, and that's enabled people outside of Microsoft. So we maintain SQL Server, SQLite, and the Cosmos DB providers. But there's MySQL providers, there are DB2 providers, there's Oracle providers, and different organizations and companies actually maintain those providers. And then on top of all that, of course, we have changes from version to version. So as a provider too, you have to stay on top of kind of what those changes are so that you can build that support into your provider as it evolves.
Okay, so it's possible, but give it to the intern and then walk away.
Exactly. Possible, but not probable.
Yeah.
We were talking a little bit just before we started about whether or not we should sort of put a abstraction layer on top of EF Core, using like a repository pattern or something like that, or just programming directly to the core. And you were sort of saying that this might depend, and so can we get into should you put that repository or not question?
Sure. So I'm a huge fan of you aren't going to need it, right? And I feel I've come across, before I was at Microsoft, I was in consulting for 10 years. And I came across a lot of projects that suffered from a lot of ritual and ceremony when you had multiple layers, and often 80% of layer X, the data access layer, was just a pass-through, right? It just took something, translated pass-through. But it was still a gesture that I had to make. Every time I added a new property, I had to visit all the layers of the stack. So my opinion on repositories is once you need them, implement them, but it wouldn't be something I go to out of the box. And so why would I use a repository? One of the reasons is testability. And so I can test a DB context, which is sort of the fundamental unit of work in EF Core. So as long as I can test that, I would question if there's value adding a repository. Maybe I don't want to take a dependency on Entity Framework Core in another project for whatever reason. So that's another reason why I might add an abstraction to that. But I would say as long as I can test it and as long as everything's functioning, I'm good. The instant I hit a place where I have to do something more complicated because of exposing the internals, if you will, of EF Core, then maybe I do want to abstract that. Another reason for a repository, the common one people think of is if I swap out my backend provider. It's very uncommon that I've seen someone actually say, okay, we're going to go from EF Core to something else. But there are customers who, for example, use EF Core and Dapper. And we're very fine with that because Dapper is very lightweight. And it's not necessarily a direct compete with EF Core because EF Core provides things like concurrency detection, change tracking, et cetera, that you can use. But for some of the queries and just getting data quickly, you can use Dapper. So in that case, using something like a repository would give you that flexibility behind that query method of which provider you wanted to go with, if you will. The other thing that I think is interesting that isn't as common that people run into, but I've found works really well, is this concept of building the repository when you have a client server application so that you can get code reuse out of that same interface, whether you're on the client or the server. And the server implementation basically implements query async as going out to EF Core or to the database and executing that query. The client representation of that is simply going to a web API calling REST or GraphQL or something else, but it gives you a very consistent model. So you're using the same entities in the same interface, and you make it very easy as a developer to know exactly which methods to go to, but your implementation is entirely different. One of them spinning up a client, making a call, getting results. The other's talking directly to the database. So those are some examples of scenarios where I'd say, okay, there it makes sense, but I don't go to it right out of the gate, if you will.
Yeah, that last scenario is kind of like the impetus of my question before, was because if you could have like an API provider to connect to a web API instead of, because then you could have just EF and treat your link and it would just call the API and do magic.
Yeah.
Just turtles all the way.
So I went down a rabbit hole. I have a project. You can go out there and see it on GitHub. It's called Expression Power Tools. And a part of it, I think, is usable, and I will take to completion, which is basically making it easier to walk and inspect expression trees. So I wanted to learn expression trees inside and out. And this sort of iterates across expression trees, helps you flatten them out, lets you do comparisons, and it just makes it easier to work with. The part that was more the rabbit hole was, I said, what if I could, in a Blazor client app, spin up a client DB context, write a link query, and just have it work?
Yeah.
And I got to a point where it was actually working, but the complexity of serializing an expression tree and rehydrating it and attaching it is something else. I'll just put it that way. So the question that has come up before is, could we have a Entity Framework client that looks just like Entity Framework, runs on the client, and just proxies to the server? And the answer is that is a possibility. The question the teams mulled over is, what does that implementation look like, right? Because what if you need to get to some of those database specific conventions? What does that look like? And is a model like what I approached, which is a REST API call that has a serialized expression tree, which could have security implications, right, that go with that as well, the right model? Or is it using something that Entity Framework thinks it's talking to a database, and we take that wire protocol and we actually just marshal that as a proxy through an HTTP tunnel? So there's a lot of interesting concepts there. I haven't seen the demand for that strong enough to say, hey, let's go out and do that. But it's definitely something that the teams talked about and looked at, and a fun project that I attempted to tackle early on.
And just remember, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Exactly.
I was going to say, for me, it's like a Jurassic Park problem. Like,
right. Clayton likes to do the complicated just for funsies. But if you're going to make us all think in expression trees, then some people are going to get angry with you.
Yeah. Well, so here's an interesting one for you. Do you know what the two most requested EF Core providers that don't exist are?
No, what are they?
So number one, based on a survey we sent out, number one is a MongoDB driver provider. Number two is an Excel or CSV.
Don't do it.
So
I could totally see that. Well, so Mongo, do we not sort of have that now with Cosmos DB being able to use the Mongo API, or is it a completely different? Is that two different paths down the?
This is a perfect example of what my role entails, right? Is when someone asks for MongoDB, I have to say, what does that really mean? So what about EF Core do you like that's not provided? Because MongoDB has an SDK for .NET, and it has various features. And so the question becomes, is it the conventions and APIs that come with EF Core that you want to reuse? Is it a question of wanting just to be able to do link to MongoDB? So is it really a link provider people are asking for and calling it EF core? Is it change tracking concurrency? So there's very good questions that come into that. Now, obviously, is it something we could do? Well, yes, Cosmos DB laid the groundwork for that. But the question is, should we do it? And that is where I would go out and talk to customers who asked about MongoDB and try to understand like what's missing from what you have today. If you install the MongoDB SDK, what don't you like about it that EF Core could fill that gap for you?
I have to learn something new. That's all.
It's a checklist of career growth.
Yeah.
It sounded complicated, so it really interested Clayton. We mentioned GraphQL a couple of times as well, and wondering what that looks like from your point of view. What is it from day to day? What is it managing? What is it like owning something like or working with the EF Core team, working with GraphQL folks? And what are we talking about when we're talking about all of that under the data umbrella?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So it's a very high level is GraphQL experience. So then how do you get from that to actually something tangible you do? And for me, it's been talking to a lot of developers. There's teams at Microsoft who use GraphQL. There's customers who use GraphQL. There's just random developers. One of the things I did was a Twitter survey and got contact information and did some interviews over email with some developers. But for me, it's understanding why, what's the motivation to use GraphQL? What are the roadblocks? What are you running into, especially from .NET, that keep you from getting your job done? And then also looking at what are the resources available out there. So, one of the things I love about, we can call it the new Microsoft or Microsoft today, is I know 10, 15 years ago, everything had to be born in Microsoft, right, and packaged. And one of the things that we're very focused on is working with the community and not necessarily replacing what's out there. So part of what I'm doing is talking to the maintainers of different GraphQL libraries and understanding what their roadmap is and what they're looking to solve. And there's several packages and frameworks out there, and it's really understanding those packages and frameworks and what developers are leaning towards and how that experience is. And helping might mean actually working with maybe someone from the EF Core team contributes to one of the existing packages. It doesn't necessarily mean we're building something here at Microsoft. So day to day, what I've done is talk to a lot of people, tried to understand some of the limitations, and then figure out a plan to see what we can do to help out with that. I mean, fortunately, there's a pretty strong ecosystem right now. There's some pretty solid packages out there, so people are getting the job done. But it's really interesting to me to see the ways people use GraphQL, their motivations for using it, and what their success stories are.
So along with some of that collaboration, you kind of brings us to Apache Spark and .NET for Apache Spark. Could you give our audience who may not be a little bit familiar with Apache Spark what sort of that is, and then what really is .NET for Spark really enabling in that?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the Spark is a distributed engine for analytics. And what that means is it's a way to scale out regardless of how much data you have, whether it's petabytes, terabytes, or there's probably some word that has bytes at the end of it that means even more data than all of that. But it's massive volumes of data, more than gigabytes. It doesn't have to be, but obviously that's the reason for the scale. And the idea is you can perform different types of operations to get analytics from your data. It can be something as simple as aggregations. It can be something as complex as abnormalities, like automatically analyzing data and finding outliers and edge cases. I actually had no clue about this term, but I think it's called K-norm clustering, which is a machine learning term, but it's a way of taking different values and figuring out how they correlate to each other. So I'll give you an example. When I demo Spark, one of the demos that I set up is taking a ASP.NET Core docs repo, pulling in all the text from that repo, and doing something called inverse document frequency, which is a way of basically saying it's not good just to count how many times a word appears, because the word the or a or and is going to appear a lot. So the concept is, if a word appears a few times across all of documents, but a lot of times in a specific document, it's more important. So if I'm talking about network routers, I may not have network routers in all of my documents, but the one that's focused on it, it appears higher. So by computing that frequency, you can surface what is an important term. And then you can do things like take a bunch of documents that may not be categorized, and based on their important terms, figure out a correlation between them and auto-categorize groups of documents. So that's an example of a path that you can go down. Now, Spark itself is an engine, and it ships with some language support. You can use Python. You can use Scala. I'm not sure the right pronunciation. You can use Spark SQL. So if you know the SQL dialect, you can manipulate that. But what was lacking was .NET support. Why .NET support? Well, if I'm a developer tasked with implementing a Spark engine, and I'm a C# developer or F# developer, or using a .NET language, do I really want to have to learn Python or Scala just so I can run my project? So that's one of the things it does, is it provides that support, but it also then allows you to leverage existing .NET projects. So for example, I can create a Spark job that interfaces with the Spark API and does things, but then I have my favorite library that pulls out stop words that just aren't important. And I can just include that and run with it. So that's one of my motivations for using .NET for Spark, is to leverage existing mindshare that I have, and I can pull those projects in. I can interact with ML.NET. So if I have some great data models there, I can use .NET for Spark to build up a set of data that I can then hand off to ML.NET. But that's the philosophy behind it, is making it accessible to .NET developers and doing it in a way that you can take existing examples and easily translate them to .NET if you need to as well.
Very cool.
And in maybe some personal news as well, I think you have recently started a new podcast on a topic that is perhaps a little personal to you and yourself. Do you want to maybe give our listeners a brief introduction into what that is, why that is?
Sure, absolutely. So the podcast, and I actually came up with a domain name that was easy to remember for once, but it's youmeandpd.org, youmeandpd. And PD is for Parkinson's disease. So it was interesting. I joined Microsoft about 4 years ago as a cloud advocate. And on that team, got to do some awesome things, travel the world, attend some pretty major conferences, and work with a lot of developers. One of the things I wanted to do is have more impact on what we're doing, not just carry the message of the product management groups, but actually influence the products themselves, like I'm doing with .NET for Spark and Unity Framework Core. So I looked for a new role. This .NET data role came up. So on a Tuesday, I was offered the role for the .NET data PM. On a Wednesday, I was diagnosed with young onset Parkinson's disease, which in a nutshell, there's not a lot of understanding of why the disease is caused. But basically, the main thing that happens is your cells that produce dopamine die. Dopamine's needed to send signals between nerves. And so you start getting sort of short circuited. So for me, the symptom was a tremor in my left hand, and I started having difficulty typing. The good news is with the diagnosis, there's some pretty advanced treatments. There's a lot of knowledge on how to slow down the progression. It's not curable today, but it can be slowed down. And so I tapped into those. I was able to get most of my typing back. I'm really not limited very much right now. That will change over time. But one of the things that was interesting was my wife suddenly came into this new role of, oh, I've got to be concerned for my husband and watching for symptoms and helping him, with medication and everything. So she became a care partner. And as she was searching for resources, she was like, I can't find anything that's really from the perspective of both the person with the disease and their care partner. And so we decided to launch a podcast and just have candid conversations with each other about the experience to help other people. And it's been pretty exciting because I've had a lot of newly diagnosed people reach out to me, and they've connected through the podcast, and I've been able to give them advice. It's interesting. It affects people different ways. Some people are devastated by the diagnosis. Some people go into denial for years. I know when I found out, I said immediately I want to become an advocate. Everyone said, be careful about telling your employer. But I said, no, I'm not going to hide this. And Microsoft has been incredibly supportive of this. They actually do a lot for accessibility and for coming up with technologies to help people who have limitations, that, for example, if I can't type, what's my voice to text kind of options, things like that. So that was worked out really well. And then the other ironic thing was that, so Tuesday, job offer, Wednesday, diagnosis, Monday, campus shut down because of COVID. So 2020 was, like for many people, just not the greatest. There were exciting things, like I love my new role, but it was a crazy week. In fact, I have not been in the office with my team since I was hired onto this new role.
Wow, I can't even imagine. That's fantastic, though. I'm glad to hear all that you've been doing and been able to accomplish there.
Yeah, it's been a fun journey, and it's opened my eyes to be more aware of situations other people are in and experiencing, and maybe I took things for granted a little too much. So I'm thankful for that opportunity to improve my empathy, if you will.
Yeah, fantastic. What sort of beginning to wrap up with, what sort of resources might you point our listeners to who are looking to use EF Core or can kind of bring that into a project or get started with .NET for Spark? Those are two different topics, obviously, but
Right.
Are there particular resources that you might kind of call out?
So I am going to call out our docs at Microsoft. So docs.microsoft.com/EF for EF Core. And I should have the Spark one memorized, but I don't. But if you do Spark and search on docs.microsoft.com, you'll come up with Spark. But, one of the things, and this again ties back to my role, we have been revamping docs continuously as part of EF Core team and Spark team. And the idea is we should have something for everyone. If you're an advanced developer and you're looking for complex scenarios that you need to understand the configuration, that should be available. But if you're brand new, we should have a experience where you can just walk through and do file new and get it done. And I would point people there because if those are missing, I want to know about it. It's an open source document repo and people can submit issues. We also accept pull requests. So if you have changes that you think will improve that, you can do that. But we want to know. We have Learn modules, which I'm looking into seeing how much coverage we have there, and if we can do any improvements or add any additional modules. And then, of course, there's third party that I can't endorse specifically just because I haven't been through the courses, but I hear great things about, like Pluralsight courses. Julie Lerman obviously is known as a luminary in the EF Core community and has highly acclaimed courses for that. The John P. Smith just released a book that is in detail for the latest EF Core. So there's some great resources out there, and we actually try to link to those resources from our own documentation as well. We're not trying to just keep you on the docs.microsoft.com site. So
I just want to back you up on the Microsoft Docs and EF Core specifically. Definitely, I've used those a lot, but the documentation push in Microsoft has not only been excellent over the last few years, but you guys are really doing excellent work. When I first started, which was definitely much later than you, but I didn't start on the Microsoft platforms. I didn't pick those things up because I couldn't get the documentation. It was back when Microsoft was closed source, and so I went and I turned to PHP and open source things that I could find, so that I could get to those technologies easier and faster. And it wasn't until I started even getting paid for what I was doing and like hired on as a developer at a consulting company, that then I needed to pick up the whole .NET stack. So the work that you're doing with the docs is fantastic. You're doing a great job with it, and it really does make a difference, because it makes me feel comfortable pointing people to Microsoft, the .NET platform and whatnot, and say, hey, use these tools because they're there and available. So just wanted to say that.
I love that feedback. If I could get that every time, can I come on again? No, seriously, it's a huge team effort. A lot of people at Microsoft working on that. We've definitely come a long ways from you signing up for an annual subscription, getting a binder with 500 floppy disks in it, and installing those for the help documentation. So really appreciate that feedback. And I know the team does too, because that is our number one goal. Again, my job is, you're a Python developer who just landed a .NET role and you want to go find resources. How can I get started and connect with data? I want to make that as easy as possible. So it's great to hear feedback that we're moving in that right direction.
Clayton, do you have some audio in the background?
I have a 3-year-old with no volume control. He's like Austin Powers when he gets unfrozen.
I have a 12-week-old puppy that I've been kind of on my toes, waiting to see if she wanted to make a debut in or cameo, I guess, in the podcast. But she's thankfully restfully sleeping right now. So
Nice.
So what has been helpful in your career that you might share with our audience, for people just getting started, or maybe looking to level up their own careers?
Yeah, a few things for me. One of them is really focusing on my goals and not letting people tell me what I can't do, but listening to the people who tell me what I can do. I was told that there were a lot of things unavailable to me without a college degree. And had I listened to that, I would have been in a very different place. And I sort of did early in my career, but then once I worked my way into the position, I learned that, set goals, go for those. But a huge help for me has been finding mentors and looking at other people who have been successful in their career, or maybe pursued a type of career that I'm interested in, and connecting with them and just learning from their experiences. And, definitely keeping my mind open to diverse possibilities. When I was looking at a new role in Microsoft, I looked at marketing. I looked at, some of our consulting arms. I looked at I've done marketing for my own businesses, but not as a role in software development. But I looked into it because I wanted to have different possibilities and options. But even with that, it wasn't me on, Bing or Google doing research, right? You Bing it and then you Google it. But it was really reaching out to people in marketing and having coffee or lunch or Zoom chat and Teams chat, and then connecting and talking about their experiences to understand that. It's actually that's been the biggest, I think, influence on my career is having mentors to help me avoid mistakes before I make them. And I still make mistakes, and I learn from them and I move on. But having those mentors can definitely help open doors.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Where can our listeners go to follow you and sort of keep up with what you're working on?
Sure. So I have this very unique branding style for my online presence. I have a Twitter account that's called Jeremy Likness. So, and it's Likness without the C, not likeness without the E. So it's Likness. But my Twitter is where I have just a focused technology stream. I try to share blog posts and links to different resources there. I have a blog that is creatively named blog.jeremylikness.com. If people want to connect with me professionally, I have a LinkedIn profile that's LinkedIn/in/Jeremy Likness. And those are probably the best ways. And my Microsoft email, I am very happy to share that is jeremy.likness@microsoft.com. And I am open to people reaching out and connecting. My GitHub repo is also Jeremy Likness. I do a lot of small projects. Like if I'm figuring out something, or if someone has a question that has a complicated answer, I try to build a project and publish it as a repo so that they have that example there.
So I'm sure we're all thinking it, but you're like virtually impossible to find then, huh?
Exactly. Yeah, I'm anonymous on the internet. If you want to dig up dirt on me, good luck. Good luck finding me.
Well, all right. This has been fantastic. Have we missed anything? Are there any other items that you wanted to be sure to get out there?
This will be totally random, but I just wanted to share that if anyone's into astronomy, I just took up a new hobby of astrophotography, and I got a telescope that takes deep sky photographs. I've taken pictures of galaxies and nebula, and I learned very quickly it's not just point and shoot. There's very complex processing and algorithms. Like you might take 2 hours of exposure that results in 600 frames of photographs that you have to sort and filter and align and do things with. So anyone interested in that, reach out to me. I'll share my resources. I don't have easy to go to links for that, but very excited about that. And yeah, so just wanted to throw that out there. That's my new well, it is kind of technical, but not C# related, we'll say, hobby. So
Super cool.
All right, Jeremy, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on. It was awesome.
All right, chat, hang out for just a minute. We'll wrap up the podcast from here. And Jeremy was kind enough to say that he's got a few more minutes to hang out and answer any questions we might have. So if you've got any additional questions, feel free to drop those in chat. With that, we will say that was Jeremy Likness. Jeremy is a senior program manager for .NET Data at Microsoft. His personal mission is to empower developers to be their best.
If you like this episode, please like, rate, and review on iTunes.
Find show notes, blog posts, and more at sixfiguredev.com.
Catch us live each week on Twitch, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at sixfiguredev.
This has been another episode of the Six Figure Developer Podcast, helping others reach their potential. I am John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.
And I'm Jeremy Likness.
We did have, I don't know if they're still on or not, but we had a individual on our Twitch stream that came on, super curly one, and they wanted to make sure and know that we're all doing a fantastic job, and they said, Jeremy, that you're inspiring.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, with the diagnosis and so forth, I think probably the only real exposure I've had is just following like Michael J. Fox in the news and things like that. What are the resources available, or what are the things that you wish others could know, should know? Are there ways to help research and development in treatments and things?
Yeah, that's actually great, because most of the people I talk to either have no clue what it is, or they've had a family member who had it, or they've heard of Michael J. Fox. And Michael J. Fox was the resource I went to. I actually started a fundraiser probably 3 days after I was diagnosed, and I'll just put a little plug in. We raised enough that there's an MVP award ceremony coming up for the Fox Foundation that I got invited to as based on the fundraising goals, which has nothing to do with me, right? It was so many people who were just generous to that. Michael J. Fox is a foundation that their goal is to go out of business. So they want to find the cure so that they don't have to be around. So that's why I'm a big fan of that. But as far as resources, I think that's a great resource for that. I think it's important for people to know that it is the fastest growing neurodegenerative disease in the world. Some people have called it pandemic, which is interesting, but there are, I think, I don't even remember the statistics, around 8 million people diagnosed, but the rate of diagnoses is accelerating faster and faster. And they believe there's a link between certain chemicals and household cleaning products and some other things that trigger that. But it's really, I don't have a week go by that I don't have several people reach out and say they just got their diagnosis and, what was it like and everything else. And so, but what I like about, there's several resources. So Michael J. Fox, I'm not saying is the best resource. It's the one I'm most familiar with. But what's great about that site is they literally have a guide that you download, a PDF guide that, here's your new to diagnosis, here's what to expect. They have interviews with people. And what I did is I went to find the people who had the least symptoms after the longest time having the disease to understand like what lifestyle changes, what things can I do that I'm in control of so that I can manage those. And then I started a blog. So now I have two blogs. I have my Hugo static website blog that has continuous integration, check into GitHub, generate the static site, upload it to Azure. And that's my technology. And then I use Wix, which is like Square or WordPress for my Parkinson's blog. But I blog about my very personal experiences and challenges and triumphs with that there. So, and it's really easy to find. I cross-link across all of them. So if people are interested in how they can help out, my Parkinson's blog has I do a fundraising campaign every year for Michael J. Fox. And they're 100% of the money that is donated to them goes to research for a cure. And then I work with them along with, I have what's called a movement disorder specialist who coaches me and tells me what trials are available that I can look at for more advanced treatments to try out.
Yeah, the treatment's kind of where I'm curious, because I remember whenever it was when they kind of announced that Michael J. Fox had Parkinson's, and they said that he was having to leave whatever show he was on. But at that time when they interviewed him, like, he was shaking a bunch. And then years later, it looks like, at least for the appearances that I've seen him make, he's not shaking nearly as much. Is there significant updates in the drug treatment, or is it mostly like lifestyle changes, or what is actually seeming to be effective right now?
Yeah, so so lifestyle changes is one part, and it's interesting. They've done a ton of studies, and the more frequent intense exercise someone does in a week, the slower their symptoms progress, the better their quality of life. So exercise is a huge thing. I haven't seen studies that break it out like weight bearing or this or that. So I kind of do a combination, but I do keep it intense and I do it frequent. Another is diet. It appears more fruit, vegetables, more organic. And I've been plant-based for 6 years now, so that wasn't a huge leap for me. As far as a treatment technology, what's interesting is the gold standard is something called levodopa, which is basically a dopamine delivery system. And that's been around, I think, since the 60s. So that hasn't changed too much. But what is newer is there is something called deep brain stimulation. That is a procedure that actually implants wires into your brain, and there's a pack that gets embedded under your chest, and it fires just electrical pulses But when it's tweaked the right way, somehow those pulses counteract the short circuit effect of lacking dopamine and can give people mobility back, remove their tremors, and do that. So that's what I'm on right now is what's called a dopamine pre-agonist. So it's not dopamine, but it encourages my body to produce more. So the cells that are still alive that produce dopamine are working a little bit of overtime. And the nice thing about that is it has very little long-term side effects. Whereas with levodopa, the longer usage can come with things like there's what's the word? I want to say dyskinesia, but basically instead of tremoring, you kind of sway like this, kind of out of control. So there's trade-offs, but there's a lot of symptoms that aren't as obvious. The tremor is what everyone always thinks about, but there's very severe muscle cramping. For me, like if I smile or try to raise my eyebrow, the right side of my face is animated. The other side is almost like paralyzed. So it just doesn't move. But there's people get depression, anxiety. So there's a mental side effect from the lack of dopamine. What's really cool is more recent research has narrowed down something called Lewy bodies, which is a type of protein called alpha-synuclein. And they've sort of made a correlation where it looks like the spread of the disease is tied to the spread of this alpha-synuclein in the cells. So there are a lot of new research trials looking at, are there ways we can destroy these Lewy bodies or at least slow their spread? And there's been promising trials both in animals and humans. And it feels like we're closer to a new stage of treatments coming out than we ever have been. But really deep brain stimulation, I think, came out in the 80s. Levodopa came out in the 60s. So there hasn't been a lot of really new, I guess, treatments coming out, but there's again a lot of trials that are getting close. And of course that was disrupted in a huge way from COVID, both because of contact limiting it, but also because of budget, right? So all the budget had to shift towards, which makes sense, right? I would rather they focus on saving lives than something that is a tough disease to live with, but isn't going to directly kill me, right? So but so that's the state of the art. And I stay on top of those studies. And if there's, for example, there's certain bacteria, gut bacteria that seem to help slow the progression of Lewy bodies. So I go out and find probiotics that contain those and take them. Like I'm doing the insurance plan of everything I can do in my control. And then the goal is slow it down as much as possible. And when a cure comes out, be less advanced and hopefully be able to take advantage of that, or at least slow it down so that I can still have a good quality of life in my later years. Because I'm 46 now, so I plan to live at least 3 times that long, right? With advancements, that's reasonable. 130, 140, right? So.
Yep. Well, at least all the non-medical treatments are stuff that would be healthy for you anyway.
Correct.
Right. So
yes.
Why not capitalize and do as much as you can?
Right. That's exactly right. I mean, the exercise, I've always been a fan of exercise. I had my own fitness business and was a certified fitness trainer back in the day. And this just reinvigorated me and had me kind of dial it up a notch. And there's things I do like Parkinson's. The thing is, it's easy to trip. Balance is an issue, falling and whatever. So I do things like burpees. So I'm used to flat on the ground, up high. I'll do one-legged squats, one-arm push-ups, things that throw me off balance and force me to get back in balance just to compensate. And then a huge thing that's actually super fun, but I believe makes a big difference, is virtual reality. And there's a game called Beat Saber that I use as an example that you can burn calories doing. You're swinging sabers. As colored blocks come at you, you have to match the color of the saber to the block and actually swipe in the right direction. So you can imagine each arm is going at a different pace and rhythm, and some of it's memorization. And, when I started playing it, I would always miss the left-handed swipe because most of my symptoms are on the left side. So that trigger of that chemical crossing that synapse was delaying me enough. But after playing and playing and playing, now I can just hit it perfectly. So I believe that doing that sort of reinforced the neurological pathway, let me make the adjustments needed to fix that. So I think we'll see some neurotherapy coming out through just VR as a possible type of non-invasive treatment.
Nice.
Yeah, I think I heard something on, like, just in passing, as part of another conversation on, like, the Tim Ferriss podcast, where they were talking about video games as therapy for, like, PTSD or for ADHD or something that, like, of course, sitting down and doing these things would help with repetition and memory and behavior and behavior modifications and things like that. So it's just amazing the things that, you know, our parents and the public were raving against when we were young. The video games are going to rot your brain, and it may end up saving us if we've got the right projects out there, the right games.
Yeah, I have a boxing game that has these discs, and you have to box them the right way. So you have side hooks and upper jabs and front punches. And I'll burn, so if I run a 5K, I might burn 400 to 500 calories running a 5K. I burn the same amount in 45 minutes of this boxing game. And it's a heck of a lot more fun than running on a day like today in Seattle, where it's, you know, 40 degrees, misty rain, kind of.
It didn't take much for you to convince. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't need much convincing that playing a video game was more exciting.
Well, it's ironic. My favorite game that I get the most playtime in is called Population One. It's a first-person shooter battle royale, and the weapon that I'm best with is the sniper rifle. And like I'm left-handed, and this is like just relaxing the tremor. But if I focus and I have that trigger aimed, I can, you know, completely stop it. And so doing that focus over and over, I keep telling myself, is helping with that. So of course I need to play that game as often as possible.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me.
Agreed.
And then we have to spend a minute or two on the astrophotography.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think we were talking about that maybe even before you joined about, you know, with the flat Earth, you just have to point in 4 directions and you've got the entire sky, right?
That's right. That makes it easy. That's actually how this telescope was designed, based on those.
Or a 360-degree camera should just be able to catch everything, right? So
it should. Yeah,
no,
I actually.
It's really cool. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say I had always been into astronomy, and I had a telescope which was kind of the traditional. It was a Celestron Dobsonian telescope, so it has kind of an internal lens, so it doubles the length, and it was, you know, kind of sight, find a bright star, try to dial it in, and that whole experience. So when I decided to get back into it, and I'm copying a link here, there's a chat in Zoom, right, that I can paste this?
Yep.
Why is my Zoom disappearing?
It does what it wants.
When I got back, where would I see there it is. It says chat. Man, this user interface is awesome. So that's a link. Whoa. No, that is a link, Corey.
So different kind
try
of
this
link.
again.
That's a tuple. That's
Copy link. Copy. Okay. But basically, when I went back into it, I said, you know what? I want to do this, but I want to do it the easy way. Like, I don't want to be tinkering around doing this. So I did some research, and there's a telescope called Stellina, Stellina, that is a CCD camera in a motorized unit that is a turnkey solution. Basically, the only thing I had to do to set this thing up was screw it into its base and level the base out, which has tripod legs that make it real easy. There's a bubble right on it.
Oh, wow.
So
yeah.
it was like 5 minutes. It connects to your phone. And what happens is when you turn it on, it points straight up, takes a picture of the stars, through analysis, maps them onto its known set of star coordinates, figures out exactly where it's at. And then you basically say, I want to image the Orion Nebula. And it tracks, picks up the Orion Nebula, slowly follows it over time, and does everything for you. It will actually process the image so you can get an image off of it, but that's never as good as if you take like 5 nights of imaging and you add them, because you get noise. I'm in a highly light polluted area. So the more exposures I take, the more I can get signal and sort of average out that noise. And then there's, the whole process. I bought some pretty expensive software that does the processing, because you have corrections for defects in the sensor. So you get these phantom pixels that look like stars but aren't. So you have software that can look at all the frames and say, oh, these things aren't moving, so those are the pixels that we need to subtract out. But then there's never perfect alignment, so you have stars shifted. So there's a step that basically looks at that and creates the translations necessary to scale and shift and rotate each frame so it layers perfectly on top of each other. Then there's the software that actually averages out the signal across all the frames and creates the image. And then you have noise reduction tools. You have what's called stretching, because the light is so low intensity that people always ask me, oh, do your pictures have filters? And I'm like, I can show you the picture without the filter, but it's black because the light is so low intensity you can't see it. And it's linear, and it's like on a scale from 1 to 100, it might be in the 1 to 3 range.
Yeah.
And so you need to stretch that out to be in the 1 to 100 range. But there's different ways of stretching it. So it's a fun process. Probably the most interesting step is called deconvolution. And this was actually created to correct a defect in the Hubble telescope lens. So the lens was flawed. So they came up with software that basically reversed the flaw. So it programmatically took into account the distortion and reversed the distortion. Well, it turns out the atmosphere is like a huge lens that distorts the image coming in. So you can sample different stars in your picture, and it can compare how they're shaped against the perfect circle, which they should be a perfect circle, figure out that deviation, and then correct for that and deconvolve the stars. So yeah, it's a fun process. I started a repo called Deep Sky Workflows and a YouTube channel that I have a couple videos where I'm just sort of, I'm a big fan of, as I learn new things, just share the experience and let other people kind of jam off that. So multiple personalities. But yeah, I posted the link to some of the captures I've taken, which the first one, the Orion Nebula, and the last one, well, the last galaxy in that gallery, and then the last moon photo are my favorite pictures so far.
So okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of the pictures that like NASA puts up and what it looks like these pictures are, they're taken over multiple light spectrums. So like the infrared spectrum and the visual spectrum and then the infrared spectrum and so on and so forth. And then they compile those, and it's the compilation of those that gets the color of the pictures. But even though your telescope sounds really, really fancy and awesome, is it doing that? Is it taking the multiple spectrums of light images, or how are the colors being added? Is that just...
It's got an array of red, green, and blue sensors on the CCD. So it is unlike, astrophotography with an analog camera, for example, or even a digital camera through a regular telescope, you'd probably have a filter, and you filter out different gases. So this nebula emits sulfur and hydrogen and something else. So you have a hydrogen filter, sulfur filter, and you get those images. And then you translate those signals into colors and combine them, and that's how you get it. This is literally a sensor that picks up red intensity, green intensity, blue intensity. and it's in an array, and that array actually favors some colors over the others based on the orientation of the telescope. And so in one configuration, it might pick up a little more blue than green and red. And another configuration, it might pick up more. I don't understand all the intricacies of that, but it creates what's called a mosaic. So it's an image that has quadrants, and the intensity in each corner of the quadrant represents a red, green, or blue pixel, and a luminosity, which is the average intensity. So you start with that, you separate those intensities into red, green, and blue and overlay those. You do something called linear fitting, which says, okay, my blue channel is slightly stronger, so let me boost my red and green channels so that the signals are more even. And then you go from there. But so it's not, now there's a feature coming out that they may add filters for this telescope, which will be useful. It has a built-in light pollution filter, but it doesn't have, like, ideally, if I could get those hydrogen sulfur filters and image those, I could get probably a lot more detail out of my pictures other than having thousands of frames that I capture over time, because the more captures you have, the better. The Orion Nebula is pretty intense, so those are like just probably 45 minutes of capture. But like the Rosette Nebula, the Jellyfish Nebula, some of the other, like the Horsehead Nebula, those were hours and hours and hours of captures, just averaging them. So if you looked at any one of the images in progress, you would see stars and nothing else. But as you layer them on top of each other, slowly that nebula starts to emerge.
Wow.
Okay, so it is adjusting the hue and saturation and stuff a little bit for in the post processing, but those are effectively, depending on the somewhat tilted by the orientation of the telescope, but those are effectively the actual real color of those shapes.
Yes, that is, when you see red, for the most part, it's boosted red. Some of the steps, you might increase the saturation and intensity, so it might not be the same. Like, I might want to draw out the detail of the Orion Nebula, so it might be a flatter contrast, and so we increase that. But the first two are showing examples of taking the actual natural color and boosting it. The third one, where it's green, that's actually using one of the artificial filters that basically manipulates the color channels. So that one, actually, the blue channel remained unchanged, but the red channel became a percentage of the green channel, and the green channel became a percentage of the red channel. And that's more just artistic. But yeah, besides that one, which I was an experiment to see how it would look, all the others are I guess you would call them the natural colors, just stretched is what it's called, boosted. So
it's no different than what I do with my camera.
Correct. Yeah, if you had a camera and took exposures and processed them, it would look very, very similar to this.
Yeah, kind of like.
Turn on the zombie filter. Do it.
I don't have a zombie. I can change the.
Did you know you can take photographs almost like this with just a regular phone? This totally blew my mind, but there's software that will actually override the default camera settings and let you take long exposures and take stacks just using your phone.
Wow.
And you can get, oh, wow. A little bit too long in the tanning booth, were we?
I fell into a large vat of grape juice.
He ate the never-ending gobstopper.
Oh, I didn't want to close that. I need to open that back up and get rid of that. That's just terrible.
Just leave it.
No, leave it. All right, Jeremy. Well, this has been a lot of fun. We could probably go on like this for hours, but
Sure.
We'll let you get back to the rest of your day. I really do appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. We are looking at, unless you've got something you'd like us to coordinate with, we're looking at about 3 weeks from today for the cleaned up audio to hit your podcast players.
Okay, that sounds good to me.
Perfect. In the meantime, if there's anything you need from us or anything that we could do for you, just be sure to let us know. Chat, we will be back on Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern for the live coding, live Wednesday personal projects and such. And next Monday, live recording of the podcast at 6 p.m. Eastern. With that, we will say goodnight and rate our friend over at Geeky Girl Sarah. So good night, everybody.
Take care. Thanks.